So cameras. Whoa, that's loud. Historically, now it's off now. Is that all right? All right. Historically, cameras in games have sort of been an afterthought for a lot of game teams, gameplays and cinematic. Usually, it's sort of a last-minute thing to assign it to somebody, give somebody ownership over the cameras, and oftentimes that person doesn't have a lot of real-world camera experience. It's getting better, but we still have a ways to go to catch up to film and television. So what I'm hoping to do in this pretty brief talk is give a basic understanding of how cameras work and function, move on to how that applies to composition, and then wrap that up with how that ties into games. Excuse me. First, a little bit of info about me. I've been animating for games for just about 14 years now. These are some of the games I've worked on, many of which you can find in the... Oh, people are supposed to move in towards the center if you can. It's getting crowded. Thank you. Yeah, so these are the games I've worked on. A lot of them you can find in Jay's bargain bin that he talked about. 14 years. I spent about 9 years at EA, a lot of sports games. I then moved to Square Enix, was animation director on Hitman, and I am now in LA at a company called Robotoki, where we're working on Human Element right now. It's a first-person survival game. Much of my career has been spent in cinematics, focused on a lot of storytelling through characters, through cameras, and a lot of those fun things. So let's jump right into it. As animators, when we begin animating a character, we're looking at a lot of reference. We gather a lot of our photos and videos and stuff like that, thumbnailing, even running around the studio doing our own moves, acting like goofs. Thanks, Zach, for the video. But how often do we do this when we're about to animate a camera? Is it still going? Oh, let's watch the whole thing. Okay. How cameras work and how they function, the language of cinematography, it's remained largely unchanged for decades, and we've grown up seeing our stories told through the eyes of these physical cameras. So because of this, CG camera can often fall victim to the same thing that characters can, and that's the Uncanny Valley. You can see this a lot in films like the bullet time sequences in the Matrix films. Sometimes it's maybe a little more subtle, like a Michael Bay film. But I think if we can understand the basic physiology of how cameras do function and work, then we can apply that to our CG, which will help us create some more believable movements, some more believable compositions. At first, cameras can seem really daunting. There's a lot of moving parts, a lot of controls. Even CG cameras have tons of things to keyframe. But really, when you break it down into its simplest parts, you only have a few things to control. You've got the lens, the aperture, the shutter speed, and where you position it and how you move these cameras. So for lenses, it doesn't... Oh, sorry, let me move this. When it comes to lenses, choosing a longer or shorter focal length isn't just about how far the camera happens to be from the subject. Every lens distorts the image in a slightly different way. Shorter focal lengths give you a wider field of view, but also creates greater depth and separation between your focal points. A longer focal length gives a much narrower field of view, but it also flattens the image, as you can see here. This is something to keep in mind, especially when you're shooting characters, as your lens can distort the facial features and sometimes take the character off model before you've even animated it. This is the difference between a 300mm and a 25mm lens. And you can see how you can easily break your character without being careful about how you choose your lenses. When it comes to aperture, it refers to the little diaphragm that controls how much light enters the camera. What it also does is it changes the depth of field. The area considered in focus is called the circle of confusion. That's that little place between the two brackets there, the focal point in the middle. If you change the amount of light coming in, you adjust the circle of confusion there. And you can see how letting in more light, moving the focal point closer or further away from the camera can also affect this. Unfortunately, in a lot of games, this is what our depth of field ends up looking like. We've got a very distinct range that's perfectly in focus, then a sharp drop-off, and then a place that's evenly out of focus. You see this used a lot in games, especially as a tool to highlight something or separate it from its background. If our goal is immersion in the universe, anything that sort of reminds us that we're looking through the eyes of a CG or a simulated environment kind of breaks that immersion. Another unfortunate side effect is this miniaturizes your characters or your environment a little bit. They look like little toy figures instead of something that was shot through a physical camera. Sorry if anybody here is from Rise. I just called you guys out. Instead of relying solely on depth of field to focus the viewer's attention, we could be using a lot of the other tools we have on hand. We've got, lighting, use of negative space, leading lines, contrast of tone and value. Limbo here, for example, was a great use of negative space and contrast of tone. This next one, from Rise, is actually a really great shot. They've framed the character in the doorway, used sort of a contrast of detail. The character in the foreground is highly detailed, where the background is starting to use more abstract shapes and leading lines, and contrast of tone sort of draws you to the character. This last one's another really great example, but on the opposite side of the scale. It's quite evenly detailed. There's saturation of detail across it, but what they've done is they've used a lot of tonal contrast and leading lines. You can see the branches leading in. The brightest point in this image is where they want you to look. Even the characters driving in towards it is those two guys on the upper right. Another really cool thing, how they've used contrast of tone, is if you look down sort of the center bottom, there's a guy there who's also an enemy wearing red in a green forest. So he stands out, clearly doesn't belong there, he's not part of that. Something to pay attention to. Sorry. So the third thing we have control over is shutter speed. So typically in games, this isn't something that's as illustrated as often as it could be. We're starting to get there now with our newer engines. This can be represented in a number of ways. Exposure, motion blur, even frame rate. As I said, we're not using them so much now, but modern engines are starting to take motion blur into account, and it is helping smooth movement out and again, create a more believable experience. The last main area we have over the control over this is where we position the camera and how we move it. As I mentioned before, cinematography and camera work hasn't really changed much. That language we're very used to seeing, and we're very used to getting our stories through this. When something breaks really sharply from this, we can run into that issue of the Uncanny Valley again. This is never more evident than at the start of the CGI craze. Flying cameras and crazy slow-mo sequences, and I'm not really selling their creative use short, but just because we can do something in CG doesn't mean we should, always. So the tools that we use for film are fairly basic. There's jib crane, tripod, Steadicam, dolly. These are constraints we're accustomed to viewing these through, but how often do we rig them like this? We do this with our characters. We study their physiology, where all the bones are in a lion, a giraffe, or anything, but we don't typically do this with cameras. I wanted to show this short clip from an Assassin's Creed trailer. If you could pay really close attention, they've really added a lot of subtle organic dirt, basically, onto the camera, and it feels like there's a physical cameraman in the scene filming this. Adding just a little bit of that goes a long, long way to creating a believable experience. Just let this play out. But it's really nice, the subtle movements, the little imperfections, because at the end of the day, when we watch these, regardless of how smooth they try to move the jib crane, how smooth the dolly tracks are, there's still a human operating that camera, and there's still little imperfections that go into that movement. So taking these basic mechanics, how a camera functions, let's just move on to composition. By now, most everybody's heard of thirds, use the rule of thirds. It's a pretty safe bet that just placing your focal point, your character's eyes, or something along any of those intersection points is going to create a sort of a pleasing composition. But I want us to start thinking about why we're choosing to put that character there. What is the purpose of that? I've got a couple more to show for this. But what are you trying to elicit from the audience? What are you trying to communicate? So example for this shot. Feels a lot different than this one. I've used the same shot, same expression, same rule of thirds, but in the first one, I'm up against the edge of the frame, and there's not a lot of movement, nowhere to go. It actually has a sort of a sense of wonder, there's something fantastic in front of me. Whereas this one, there's sort of a sense of impending danger, or there's something about to crush me. Really, it's just using the same thing, but just choosing to use different scale and different position on the frame. I love this shot. This sequence, if you haven't seen, everybody's seen Forrest Gump, right? It's a very, very deliberate use of thirds. Forrest has been running, he's been running for over a year, I can't remember exactly how long. And he gets to the end of his run, and he's run out of frame, metaphorically, visually, everything. His return home is behind him, and it's a great representation of how he's just hit the end of his willpower, his whatever journey he was on. What also sort of emphasizes this in the movie is that almost the entire movie, and I encourage you to go back and watch it, Forrest is framed dead center in the frame for most of the film. Anytime there's a big sort of changing moment for him in his character arc or anything like that, then he starts to be put on a third, or there's movement in the frame. But for the rest of it, he's a very neutral character in his universe. It's the external characters that are the sort of extremes in his life that come in and out, and this is such a great sort of illustration of that, being very deliberate with how you choose the thirds. One of my favorite directors who most notably uses composition in a very deliberate manner is Wes Anderson. Any of his films are absolutely just a course on how to use composition to tell a story. Should probably have left the volume on. So one common issue that we do run into is the unintentional use of tangents. Tangent, the dictionary definition of a tangent is a straight line or plane that touches a curved or curved surface. But sort of for our purposes, it's more of a general thing that any time two lines touch but don't cross over. You can see this a lot in film and TV, and when used deliberately, it's great because it draws your eyes exactly to where you want to. But a lot of times this is done unintentionally, and it can take the viewer's eyes away from what you wanted to them. Some common sort of uses, you can see this like heads touching the top of the frame. This is a very, very common one. You can either crop in or pull back to get rid of this, but your eyes are sort of drawn to these intersections. A couple more shots of heads touching the top. How much control converging lines have over the viewer's attention is something that's actually been measured. There are several companies that test all sorts of things with eye tracking software, and they can see what visual stimuli draw people's attention. And they've created heat maps to show this, and you can see on here, there's a vanishing point at the end of the tracks. They were drawn to that immediately, but now there's a point of contrast where there's movement and a darker object in the scene, and they're drawn to that. And you can see, as this camera pans through this shot, when there's ambiguous space and there's not a lot of focal points, you see them darting all over, darting all over. The size of these is relative to how long they stayed on that area. But you can see they're searching, searching, searching. They're finding contrast points, then there's movement, and they're on it. And it's really telling how people sort of see your stories, and to be very deliberate about what choices you're giving them to focus on is super, super important. I'll let this finish out. But you can see as it goes behind the building, now they're looking around, looking around. A while back, Chris Roman storyboard notes from The Simpsons was circulated a lot, and this became sort of, I think, a little bit taken too literally. A lot of their notes were that to always switch from a two-plane focus to more of a three-plane, always show three planes to create a more dynamic angle. I think using this, you can usually get pleasing shots, but you're ignoring the use of a lot of other uses of space. So you've got limited, flat, deep, or even ambiguous space. Flat space, in its most basic definition, is a two-dimensional thing. There's not a lot of perspective or vanishing points. The opposite side of that is deep space. One or more vanishing points, spacing and scale of objects or focal points, creating the feeling of depth. Limited space is sort of a combination of the two. You can kind of think of it as a diorama. You've got multiple planes of two-dimensional space playing on different layers from the camera. Wes Anderson, again, uses this quite a bit. Hitchcock did a lot as well. The last one is ambiguous space. This removes any cues of depth and places the viewer in a much more uncertain state about where they are, and this can be a very, very useful tool for creating unease in your viewer. A lot of these can be used to sort of elicit specific reactions, like I said. Using too much of any in a sequence can do the opposite. You can start to devalue what you're trying to accomplish. But juxtaposing them next to each other, creating strong contrast, then you can maintain that. You could use this in a game. Say you were making a game where half of it was spent inside a mech or inside of a base, but the other half was spent in a large open world, contrasting that with sort of a limited or flat space. But then when you're out in the world, it's much stronger if there's dynamic angles, wide angle lenses, and things like that, instead of always shooting like Michael Bay and everything's a beer commercial. Flat space, deep space are often used to plus story moments. Flat space is also used in a lot of comedy, you'll notice, to punctuate the comedic moments. Deep space is very dramatic, very emotional. Other tools you can use, negative space and contrast of tone or value. Negative space is a low detail, there's sort of blank space next to a high detail or strong silhouette. Another tool, contrast of tone or value, using light and dark, contrasting colors, draw the viewer's eye to where you want them to look. Another example, this also employs vanishing points and leading lines to just suck you right into where he wanted you to look. The opposite, this is a good example of ambiguous space. Sometimes you don't want to create a sharp thing. You want more of a ambiguity in your shot. You want to show that your character is in a safe place. If there's continuity of tone and pattern, like you can see here, this is a great shot. Zach Braff's character is in sort of a very ambiguous place in this point in the story. He's returned home for a funeral. It really conveys perfectly the feeling that he wanted to give the viewer at this point. Even the choice to place him sort of dead center in the frame was very deliberate and effective. At this point, he's sort of, juxtaposed with his expression. It's perfect. It's such an awkward shot, and it's really, really memorable. Alternatively, if you reverse this, you can make the character feel a bit more tense. And this is such a great shot that sort of echoes who these characters are and what split sides of his personality. You see Edward Norton framed. It's all grays. It's very linear. Everything's perpendicular. You see Brad Pitt's silhouette. Everything's jaggy. It's bright, saturated colors. He's even got the brown doorway. He's not quite framed properly, so you can see it's a visual representation of who these guys are as characters. So moving the camera during the shot should also be a very deliberate choice. If done without consideration, maybe too frequently, you'd be diluting the value and the effectiveness of the tool that you have. For example, it's become really, really popular to do first-person cameras. This sort of POV-style movement says to the viewer that they're looking through the eyes of somebody that's in the scene. And if this is not what you're trying to convey, then you're diluting your currency. Battlestar Galactica was, I think, a big reason why we've got a lot of these crazy rack focuses and stuff like that these days. Again, if you use this too much, Michael Bay, it's confusing, it's tiring to watch, and you're sort of, again, what did I do? Michael Bay, right? All right. So all this is fine for cinematics, but what about gameplay? First-person gameplay, the camera is the character. The limits on what we can get away with are quite limiting. FOV and depth of field. Anytime you take control away from the user, you run the risk of breaking immersion. Any changes you make need to be done subtly in a very natural way. It's very easy to pull the character out. Small changes, going from stationary to faster movement to illustrate speed. Going from indoors to outdoors, because sometimes it actually serves gameplay as well to have a greater field of view. And sometimes you can get away with a little bit of control, taking control away from the user to interact with objects in the scene, but it does need to be done in a very subtle way. I think this is just about done. One more. As you can see here during the roll, or during, interacting with this electrical box, you can see that it took control, but it was a very fluid control. In third person, you can have a little more control over the camera and where you place it. You can see some differences here when entering and exiting cover situations, or actually there's a good spot here where as he goes indoors in this watchdog clip. You can see we push in a little bit more, creating more of a confined feeling. It's a very deliberate choice. You can also, to communicate objectives or things like that, you can take some slight control away from the user. They do this in the combat sequences here. So regarding field of view, it's a common misconception that FOV size is directly related to motion sickness. Like this. This is basically, I just took a camera and I constrained it directly to the head of a character running. Wider FOV sort of reduces this, but it's just movement relative to what's in frame. We were looking into this a little bit at Robotoki, and one of the teammates sort of realized that if you stabilize the horizon, you don't need to eliminate the movement, but it actually does reduce. Well, he was getting violently sick one day because somebody changed the value in a camera during our play test, and he couldn't play it for more than 2 minutes. This is the exact same thing, just with the horizon stable. There's no difference in the camera movement at all, but it's a much more stable experience. All I did was stabilize the rotation relative to the horizon. Why this is, I think, is because as humans we've evolved a number of stabilizing mechanisms to maintain sort of visual stability on objects, whether it's a predator or prey or anything like that. There's some really complex things that do this. We've got the vestibulo-ocular, vestibulo-colic, and vestibulo-spinal, and that all works sort of in tandem to maintain still head movement, still eyes. And if anything breaks that, we start jittering around and rotating the camera wildly. It's counter to that, and it feels unnatural. We feel queasy, and you're watching a Michael Bay movie. It's an evolutionary thing, and it's hard to run away from a bear if you can't see straight. So I think that is just about it. I'm going to leave you guys with some reading material. This was very light coverage. This is something that could take forever to cover all the little bits, but I cannot recommend these two books enough. Bare Bones Camera Course by Tim Schropel. which was actually one of the first books ever given to me when I started animating. Literally is a bare bones book. There's like stick figures to illustrate how to frame things, but it's great, short read. The next one, which is a bit more advanced, is a visual story from Bruce Bloch. I had the chance to see him speak at a SIGGRAPH once, and completely changed how I look at composing shots. So I definitely suggest reading that. As far as websites, check out the 7 Golden Camels. Mark Kennedy, who writes this, is a story artist at Disney, and he was the lead story artist for Tangled, and he is, it's just so full of amazing information. Definitely go check that out. And that is about it. I think I have about 5 minutes for questions, and as always, is that not showing up? There it is. Yeah, you can, I love talking about this stuff, so feel free to contact me or come grab me afterwards. And yeah, maybe 4 minutes for questions if anybody has any. No questions. All right. It was perfectly clear. Thanks.